Kako, everyone. Welcome to another special episode and special panel for the Moana Nui podcast. We are here to celebrate Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Month with this exclusive series here on the show. My name is Moana McAdams. I am the founder and host of the Moana Nui podcast and children's book author of the Adventures of Nakoa and Nohea children's book series, editor of the Wild Card Chronicles, and publisher for Burning Spear Comics, and most importantly, champion and advocate for the Indigenous, Asian American, Pacific Islander, and Native Hawaiian communities. As always, I'm joined by my beautiful co-host, Dana.
Aloha, everyone. I am Dana. For those that may or may not know me, I am a cosplay event and staff con photographer. You've probably seen some of my photographs with Dragon Con, MomoCon, Anime Week in Atlanta, and even with DC Comics. I'm also a voice actor and an event planner and a whole lot more. And now I'm going to hand it right back over to my beautiful co-host, the lovely Moana.
Alrighty, guys. Well, we want to give as much time as we can to our panelists. So I'm just going to introduce real quick our guest moderator. She's been on our show before, and we are so excited to have her back to share this platform and really lead this conversation this evening. So let us bring on Havana Wynn.
Hey! Hi, Dana. Hi, Moana. Thank you so much for having me back.
Well, welcome. It's a pleasure.
Exactly.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, I want to jump right into it. So basically, welcome to our panel discussion on Asian solidarity in Black Lives Matter. I am both nervous and excited about moderating tonight's discussion, especially on the tail of, we saw, the BLM movement get really major traction last year. Now we're seeing Stop Asian Hate. And of course, what better time to do it than during Asian Heritage Month, right? So I'm excited about our guest today. I'm going to go ahead and have them quickly introduce themselves, starting with Sue-Ann. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Havana, and thank you so much for having me on this show. My name is Sue-Ann Hong, and I'm the president and CEO for the Center for Asian Pacific American Women. It's a national nonprofit organization focused on leadership development for AAPI women.
Perfect. Perry?
Hi, thank you for having me. What a pleasure to be here. My name is Perry Young. I am a fourth and first generation Chinese American born in Oakland, California. I'm an actor and musician.
Let's see, Cece?
I had to unmute myself for a second. Hello, I'm Shauna Lawson. Some people know me as Cece the Geek. I am a cosplayer, philanthropist, activist, if you will, and also the CEO and founder of HBCUCon.
Perfect. Demetrius.
Good evening. Thank you for having me here on this wonderful panel. My name is Demetrius Angelo. I am the founder and executive producer of the Urban Action Showcase and Expo, where we celebrate diversity and the multicultural achievements, specifically in the blockbuster action genre, bringing both access and awareness to heroes of color.
Perfect. Christian.
Hey, good evening. My name is Christian O. I am the executive director and president of the DC Asian Pacific American Film Festival, and very involved with the Asian American community here in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area.
Perfect. And Dedrin, do we have you, Dedrin? Oh, Dedrin, you're on mute.
Good evening now.
Ooh.
Yeah. Not sure where that stream is coming from. I'm going to mute.
Dedrin's calling in from the multiverse. All right, let's try. So FYI, audience, Dedrin is having a little bit of issues with audio. We'll try to work with this during the panel. Let me see. All right. Dedrin? Oh, uh-oh. Okay. We're going to, we'll get back to him. Well, thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you so much. Oh, Dedrin, I see you.
I think we have a singular ring this time. So again, everybody, thank you so very much. My name is Dedrin Sneed, here in Atlanta, Georgia, founder of Subsume, a creative-based platform for technology, creativity, and community with Black and inclusive storytelling. Happy to be here. Thank you all so much.
He's scrappy and resourceful like us all. So we're going to have I have so many questions for this discussion. But before we touch on that, I just wanted to go over a couple house rules. We're here to learn. Of course, I encourage everyone to be respectful. There will be tough topics, but we are here to learn, not to attack. I kindly ask people not to interrupt or talk over each other. I'll have to be the bad guy if that happens, but I'm sure it won't be. And also to the audience, this is an hour panel discussion. There is no way we can cover absolutely everything. So consider this like a start of the discussion, right? We're here to learn, but we're gonna give you some resources on how to expand on that learning afterwards as well. All right, so I wanted to kind of start off by asking all of you, in the past year, we've seen the biggest civil rights movements and protests explode all over the country, all over the world last year. And now we see this rise of Stop Asian Hate. Have you been surprised by the momentum of these two movements over the past 12 months? Yeah? Do you want to talk about like are you surprised? Were you surprised by how big they got?
I don't know, like disappointed but not surprised. It's kind of been like the mood I've been since 2016. Where it's like we've seen this progressive uprising, if you will, based on like white supremacy and hatred of the other. And much of it is rooted in anti-Blackness. So we saw it like, manifest in violence, at least with Black people more recently with, Trayvon Martin and all those various, hashtags, people who have lost their lives. And, then more recently in the Trump administration and thereafter, we've seen all these attacks on, Asian people, on Latino people, even prior to that, folks getting locked up in cages and all that stuff. So it's just been this progression, and it's like, until you face it head on and really deal with it and accept that this kind of is our country, at its history and stuff, I feel like we're kind of in denial, like, oh, we're not a racist country. I feel like we're in denial of that. But at any rate, I say all that to say that it doesn't really shock me as much, but it's just like still surreal.
Right.
Still to see.
Yeah. Christian?
Yeah, I agree. It hasn't been a shock because racism has been around historically since the dawn of man, right? Even I'm sure there was even what I would call discriminatory practices, even by cavemen, for whether you're light-skinned, dark-skinned, tall, short, whatever it may be, to prejudice against someone. But historically, if we go back, history repeats itself. If we go all the way back, not just to the slavery and Civil War, but there's been these instances of solidarity where, like during the Philippine-American War, Black leaders and soldiers opposed U.S. colonization for the Filipinos, African Americans protesting against the Vietnam War, Japanese internment. There was joint Black and Japanese activism. So we go into history over and over again. So I'm not shocked because it's always been there. But more importantly, I think we've gotten better at shedding light on it. And what I mean by that, because of technology, because of social media, everyone's got a camera now on their phone. It's being highlighted, and we didn't have that even 20 years ago. So I think there's a lot more what I would call capability of us being able to expose things and show things in this day and age. So
right, yeah, absolutely. Anyone else have reactions to the movements of the past 12 months?
I'd like to add that it was surprising to see after, after George Floyd's, we all witnessed what happened to George Floyd thanks to somebody's camera.
Right.
And we also have to acknowledge Rodney King's whole event was thanks to somebody's video camera. So we as people, our citizens, are empowered now through social media to have another reality that's not told by our mainstream news. So we actually can start to write our history. So I was actually not surprised to see so many people come out to support George Floyd's, because we all witnesses as we were home, isolated during the COVID. So we had a lot of people had nothing better to do. And when this happened, it fueled a bunch of, activism. And I was heartened to see a lot of young white people come out to support this movement. And I think, I have to give all the props to all the Black Lives Matter, to Black Lives Matter, to the women who started it, and to everyone who came out. And I think it was a much bigger movement because we saw young white people marching along Black Lives Matter. And then we started to see Asian people marching with Black Lives Matter, and the hashtag Asians for Black Lives come out. And it was all in solidarity of what we're tired of hearing. We're in the system, institutionalized white supremacy, and we are all like ready to fight this head on.
Right.
So it was heartening for me to see.
Yeah. One of the things that was surprising was, the emergence of that hashtag, Asians for Black Lives. And one of the questions I know people are wanting to hear about is, how do, especially the Asian panelists here, how do you address anti-Blackness and white supremacy with Asian immigrants and other Asian Americans? I mean, there's such a diversity of opinion there.
Yeah. So I'll take that just to start the conversation. So right when Black Lives Matter was just right after George Floyd, and I remember there was a tremendous amount of conversation going on at the national level. There were, and CAPA, which is the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, they were all coalescing these 37 organizations to say we are with our, brothers and sisters of Black Lives Matter, we support. But I remember I got a phone call from this one Asian woman who said, look, I'm all about supporting Black lives, but what about Asian people who are getting harassed and whatnot? So, and she said that she actually got stopped, like they were having on a panel discussion, and she actually got stopped talking about, Asian people and what was happening. She literally got cut off in that conversation. So I think she felt like she wasn't seen, even though we're talking about racism as a whole. So that's an example of, I think, where we have to make sure that we're being inclusive of the conversation. It is not just about one race or another. It's us today, but it's somebody else tomorrow. So we've got to make sure we're coordinated here and supporting each other.
Right.
If I may, I think that, Asian people, like you said, are not a monolith, and then there are different generations. Obviously, there are recent immigrants, and the Asian American population have almost doubled in 20 years, and most of those are recent immigrants. So, and when you think about the model minority and who are the 1%, rich Asians compared to the recent immigrants and the poor Asians, we are the largest gap in terms of wealth. We have the smallest percentage of rich people compared to the largest percentage of poor people. I mean, this is bigger than the African American community. So most of those crimes are perpetrated from, onto recent immigrants in impoverished neighborhoods. So we have people in impoverished neighborhoods next to each other, because I grew up in one in Chinatown in Oakland. Next to West Oakland was one of the most impoverished Black neighborhoods. So there was a lot of tension, but I also had Black friends, good friends. So I saw that, hey, Black people are not the same. I have good friends and bad friends. There are criminal elements, and there are people who are my best friends. So if we can look at situations where it can also be based upon class, it's not just race. Black minority people of color fighting each other is a symptom of racism. It's not. and so it's pointing out the other person, and you have to ask who's pointing out. Like, look at the Black people. It's, you know, I had people on my feed saying, well, it's not us attacking Asians. Look who's on the video. And pointing out another race for attacking a race is also a symptom of white supremacy. So we have to look at the container of how these how violence happens.
Oh,
and
yes.
you know, and you know, when people are impoverished, when we're given a small slice of the pie, we're going to fight harder for that small slice of the pie. So yeah.
I have to wholeheartedly agree with Perry. And I mean, it goes without saying that there's always been tensions amongst the different ethnic communities, Black and Asian, Hispanic and Asian, and even within our own Asian communities, whether it be Japanese Americans versus Korean Americans, or the Chinese against the Japanese, or Vietnamese, whatever it may be. So there are examples of intolerance in all directions. But it's the low moments that we have to remember do not erase the fact that at our best, meaning if all the communities were at our best, we have to come together repeatedly to advance the cause of justice. And today's crisis, whether it be Black Lives Matter or Stop AAPI Hate, is no exception. Now, obviously, not all Americans, whether it be African Americans, Asian Americans, even white Americans, they don't know how to support BLM or AAPI organizations. They don't know about the issues. They don't understand that it's more than just, you know, calling for justification or more funding or physical protection or inclusion, all that. We collectively, if we want to somehow define what our great-great-grandkids were going to learn in the history classes, we need to come together and stand against hatred. I just want to quickly tell you, my upbringing, when my father brought us to this country, we came to Ames, Iowa, of all places. I was the only Asian kid in a 1,000-mile radius. And then from there, we moved from Ames, Iowa, because he was breaking stereotypes. He was the first Asian to go to school at Iowa State University for a doctoral program in engineering. We ended up moving to Roanoke, Virginia. And again, the only Asian kid in a class of 500 students. One best friend was Black, the other best friend was white, and I didn't know where I fit. And then having to deal with the bridging between the white community and the Black community, because there was no Asian community for me to be a part of.
Right.
So I gravitated to the African-American side more than I did to the white side. And it was just, it made me realize that if I'm going to be American, we need to be able to sort of leave a legacy that all of our progeny will be very, very, you know, proud and also uplifted from. So I think we still have a lot of challenges, obviously, but I am hopeful. So.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you for that. One of the questions I had, so I've been dabbling in like peeking at conversations within Asian communities online, Black communities online. I'm going to read out a quote. I'm kind of paraphrasing. And it was from a Black female Twitter user. And she said, "We are tired of Black women having to cape for everyone else when no one capes for us." What is your reaction to that statement? Do you agree, disagree?
I guess I'll take that. I guess I'll take that. Oh, you know, yes and no. You know, yes and no. I do think that there are examples where people have, you know, come to our allyship and come to our aid, whether it's other Black women or, you know, Black men, people of other races and what have you. But you know, and however, right. Moreover, it does seem like from, you know, a statistical standpoint or a personal standpoint that Black women more often do, you know, kind of come to everyone's rescue, and it's not really reciprocated. And it kind of shows up in various ways, you know, everything from, you know, the economic disparities and jobs and what have you, hiring, housing, even in like marriage and dating statistics, Black women are least likely to get picked, whereas Asian men, you know, when it comes to men, it's like Asian men are on the, at the bottom of that spectrum. So it's very interesting how that manifests But, you know, as a Black woman, it kind of does, moreover, feel that way. And I wish that there was, to the point where, you know, other Black women, Black women throw us under the bus. So I do wish that there was more support and more solidarity just among all people of color, not, you know, just with us specifically, but I'm like, and yes, I see you raising your hand, so I'm looking forward to your insight.
So COVID-19. Okay, we already had women of color struggling. December, you have 140,000 jobs lost, majority, you know, Black women, Latino women. And the fact is they are under stress. And here's the bottom line is it's, you know, there was a study done, McKinsey and Lean In, when they talked about the fact that we are concerned. We made progress in the last 6 years, and this COVID-19 is basically wiping out all of the progress that we've made for women. And so when you look at Stop API Hate as an example, women are 2 times more likely to be attacked than men. And so when you combine all of the economic disparity, the gender and the racial biases and what happened, especially like in Atlanta, the shootings and whatnot, we are ringing the bell here, the warning bell for women of color. And so we have got to come together. So what I find is that doing the work that I'm doing, I find there's more commonality amongst the women of color. And that whether it's Black women, Asian women, Hispanic women, and by the way, Native American women who are even more invisible than Asian women. And so I think when you look at some of the issues, yes, there are cultural nuances, but we have got to pull together because we've got to do this together because we are literally wiping out all of the progress. And by the way, there was a study done. This just tells you prior to the pandemic that they did a study in England where they looked at men and women surveyed in the same family, husband, wife, and they said a woman has 1 hour of uninterrupted time where a man has 4 per day.
Wow.
So when you're talking about majority of that, you know, child, you know, rearing and the you know, school at home and all that, it falls still on the woman. So we have got to support each other. So I'm kind of passionate about that, as you can tell.
Yeah, I wanted to quickly add, if I could, because everyone's comments were just, I was writing this down. I think there are common forms of discrimination among all people of color, but particularly in the Asian and Black communities. And, you know, like anti-Blackness, ethnocentrism, classism, colorism, and then, like you said, to your point, Ms. Sue, misogyny. So it's, yeah, very interesting. And then that kind of puts Black women at a particular disadvantage because it's all, you know, a horrible intersection. And transphobia, all that.
Christian, go ahead.
No, well, Dedrin, you had your hand up too. I didn't know.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Okay, so I think both Cece and Sue-Ann point out something that's vital, and that is beyond just the gender lines, the indigenous lines. There's also more. I think there needs to be a struggle to forge new bonds. If you look, you know, I like history. So if you look back between unlikely bonds, let's say between Malcolm X and Yuri, I think the last name was Yuri Kochiyama, who was a Japanese-American human rights activist. They became friends and helped each other develop global perspectives on not just human rights, but what I call racial and cultural rights. And we need to do more of that. I mean, you look at Grace Lee Boggs, who dedicated, you know, a majority of her 100-year life to, you know, revolutionary justice and civil rights. So it needs to be beyond just the barriers of gender, indigenous culture. It has to happen even amongst the different racial lines as well. I mean, another thing is Jesse Jackson. You know, after Vincent Chin's murder, you guys all know who Vincent Chin is, I assume, Chinese-American man who was beaten to death in Detroit by the 2 white automotive workers who mistook him for Japanese because they were pissed off that, you know, Japan was ruining the U.S. automotive industry. But to have someone like Jesse Jackson and leaders of the NAACP saying, "Hey, we need to bring attention to this." So there needs to be these lines of solidarity that need to continue to happen, regardless of gender, indigenous, or cultural, or racial. So,
No, well said.
I think just to add to what Christian, I'm sorry, Dejan, you had your hand up. You should, yeah. Just to add to what Christian said and get back to your original question is, I think that it's an issue of patriarchy, right? So we men, men have to step aside and let women speak. I mean, what Sue-Ann just said about like women having 1 hour uninterrupted. These days, I mean, I did some anti-patriarchy training, and basically we need to learn how to shut up. Men, just like when we're in a room, we need to not talk when there are women in the room and let the women talk, because women feel intimidated, but yet I see so many amazing women doing the work, like our host today, like you, the moderator. And I was on a panel earlier run by women, I mean, and when I had my theater group, it was all women bringing us all across America to perform. Women are really doing the work, and men just need to shut up. I mean, so on that note, I'm going to shut up for a while.
Love it. Dejan, did you want to?
Well, no, I mean, I think there's been so many good points to that. To kind of just jump back one question as I look to try to follow up. I think it's the premise of this, and again, I think this is a fantastic conversation, is that we all have to, I think there's a understanding that needs to be a broader conversation, that race in and of itself is a social construct, right? It's not something that exists in a biological or physiological sense. Just more so that, the way that we delineate ourselves, through cultures and through experiences is beautiful, from a human perspective, but again, gives us that same opportunity to alienate and devalue or really not differentiate ourselves in ways that we shouldn't. So ideal that when we're talking about solidarity, that we look at it in the sense of constant and consistent solidarity. I think we can come together, when we see like a tragedy like we saw here in Atlanta with these killed, with several types of, racially motivated attacks, whether that's Ahmaud Avery or the spa killings that we had here, that we can all galvanize behind what we all see is clearly wrong, right? When you look at the tape of George Floyd's murder, we know that that's inherently wrong. But at the same time, we have a social construct that defaults back to those lines of not being each other's allies. And I think in our inherently we look to do that, but I think because it's built on a sense of more on apathy than of hate, right? I don't think people go out of their way to hate to hate other people like that, but I think it's the idea that we don't advocate. We're more witnesses than advocates, and I think we seen here with COVID that we have a lot more opportunity for that advocacy, across gender, across those what we acknowledge as race, cultural, what have you. That said, my perspective is that along communities of color, that we do acknowledge matriarchal roles, particularly in families, right? We see that strength that we rely on, particularly like we speak the example for the Black community. We honor our mothers in that sense, our aunties and things of that nature. But then when it comes across, for an opportunity for jobs, for leadership in government, those other parts, I feel like, we are missing the mark in letting that same level of respect that we a lot of times have at home in our most personal and intimate relationships don't into that equity and equality, across roles of change. And I think that's the part where if we're able to garner anything out of how we can do this, particularly, across these opportunities, I think that's been it. And I think I like that is really the key for true and consistent change from there.
No, thank you for that, Dejan. Oh, we lost him. he'll be back. All right. So one thing I want to talk about is social media's role in all of this, right? So, Perry, you mentioned a couple things I want to touch on here, which is number one, we are empowered by phones, and it's like footage that has, viral footage that has kind of like shown, it was kind of like the catalyst for a lot of these movements, right? But I was looking at some of the, on a lot of the Asian outlets and like seeing all these Asian attacks. I do see a lot of Black attackers. However, but if you really look at the numbers, like I see a lot of Black attackers, but the statistics on the hate crimes against Asian Americans show that 75% of attacks against Asian people have been white in the past. So I'm like, so yes, there is a spike up, but I find it very hard to believe that all of a sudden the numbers flip, right? And so, number one, I'm not sure why, but the reason why I'm bringing this up now is, like, unfortunately, in the Asian community, there's a lot of talk. There's a lot of, like, a new wave of anti-Blackness emerging from that, and also people who are kind of ridiculing BLM supporters within the Asian community. Like I saw a comment saying, "Where are all the BLM Asians now?" Right? But at the same time, it's like it's hard to describe to someone who's not well versed in these discussions that white supremacy is still the root of this. And it's weird because, you know, with the algorithms on, like, is it because of the media coverage? Like, am I only seeing the Black attackers and not seeing the white attackers? What are your thoughts on, like, how social media has kind of created these echo chambers, but also, like, media coverage showing, like, more Black attackers? Like, what are your thoughts on this? Demetrius, we'll start with you since we haven't heard from you yet.
Well, first I'd like to say that we should always identify the devices that divide. That's number one in all things, right? So whether it be an issue in education, lack of understanding of someone else or other cultures. And the second thing we need to realize is, who are these people that we're seeing, right? So older people like myself, you know, I'm born in the 60s. So my parents, my grandparents, they're the ones that marched. But remember, they marched for everybody. Dr. King was always about everybody. We never marched for ourselves. You have civil rights today is because a Black man stood up for everybody, because a Black woman sat down for everybody. So it's never been about, you know, a certain, you know, demographic, geographic, or anything else. It's always been about humanity when it came to people, you know, African-American population or Black people. Right. So when you're talking about social media, you're talking about most likely a younger generation that's on there that's not as informed. And don't forget, remember, we get all of our information, right, from our sources, right? And our sources today is social media rather than television, but there is a clash, right? So you have I would say, frontline perspective, right? And that's people on social media, that's people with their phones and so forth. And then you have the controlling perspective, right? These are the entities that control what you see, right? Fox will give you one perspective. CNN will give you another perspective, right? And then you have, you know, a generation who only watches YouTube, like my son. So depends on who's trending, you know, that's the information. So most people will not do the research. Most people will not look around at sources that they don't find relevant, right? Because you can't convince most Republicans that a lot of the things that they do are racist or anti-human, if anything else, right? Because they are rooted in a construct, as Didrin said, a construct that they wholeheartedly believe in, that cognitive dissonance that we've been, you know, talking about. So it's very hard to get people to see a different perspective. So when you're bombarded by, you know, a certain narrative, that's what you're going to form your opinion on. Unfortunately, most people.
Yeah. Do any of you feel like you're in an echo chamber? Like, Sue, you had your hand up.
Yeah, you know, you made me think of something, Demetrius. And one of my friends said this to me. You know, we were talking about being logical, and we realized it's like, it is not always about logic. And a lot of times it is about emotion. It is about the have and the have-nots. What do you have to lose? I always feel like, you know, a lot of times, you know, when you're talking about somebody gaining something, that means I'm going to lose something. And I feel like we're all fighting for the same pie. And I'm like, let's build a bigger pie. You know, so I think that's part of it, is the fact that you're not, you know, to your point, Demetrius, there is no, you know, there's no time for research because you're getting bombarded with information.
Yes.
And so if you, it's almost like you're getting brainwashed with if you're getting the same information over and over, it's almost like you're getting brainwashed. So I think it is not all about logic. It is not always about the truth. And so I think the issue is, it always comes down for me, relationships. You know, if I want to know more about, you know, the Black experience, guess what? I want to talk to Cece as a person and get to know her, right? That is what it's going to take. And so I say that because I think we assume it's about the truth and the logic, and it is not.
Right. No, so true.
Can I respond on that just 1 second? When you talk about relationships, I must totally agree. Now, looking at me, you would say, well, what relationship do I have with the Asian community? Well, you don't know me, so you don't know, right? But you can assume, you might assume by just looking at me that I might not have a relationship. But I have a great relationship with the Asian community. My first relationship with the Asian community is what gave us our perspective, is the martial arts. The martial arts gave us our first non-white heroes on the screen. And at the end of the day, everybody needs a hero, right? Everybody's looking for the hero. Why do you think superhero films are so popular, right? The second part about me that you wouldn't know, I have a half Chinese son, you know? So my point is, it's about lack of understanding. And yes, we are bombarded, but we have an account. Everybody has an accountability. There has to be accountability that we all have within ourselves to do better and to be informed. Because at the end of the day, this is the construct that we live in. We live in a controlled environment. Our history books give us stuff that we all know that's not true. We all know Columbus didn't discover America. How do you need to, how does a place that is already populated and thriving need discovering? You see, it's the construct. That's why I talk about the devices that divide. So when we realize the root to the fruit, right, and know that the root is bad, so the fruit is bad, we can begin to make the difference that we need. So Perry knows, and this young brother here, Christians, are going to know that we have always stood together. Perry will tell you, us in the martial arts, you know what I'm saying? Because we have a certain foundation, and that foundation is honor, respect. You see what I'm saying?
And
discipline.
I would say to Demetrius's point is that if you don't know Demetrius, but I do personally, because he gave me an award for being a person of color in the Urban Action Showcase Festival. You know, so it's like, you know, there's solidarity right there. But I think to get to your original question, Havana, about the young Asian American community on social media, pointing at Black Lives Matter, it's the same thing as, again, it goes back to, if you're pointing at another race, that's a symptom of white supremacy.
Yes.
You know, so I disagree with whoever they're saying. Yeah. If one, you know, it's very simple. You know, how the Constitution was written was, you know, everybody else we were not human according to who wrote the Constitution. Black people were not fully human. Right. Asians were not fully human. Native Americans were not fully human. Women were not fully human. I mean, we couldn't vote, right? You know, you couldn't vote. We could not testify. We could not against a white man who lynched us. We could not own land. We could not own arms. So all those things in the foundation of this country resonates today. Those things don't go away because they're in our psyche of what built this country. You know, so so instead of pointing at the problem, I would say find our shared goal of what we want America to be. Yes. You know, I don't want to say it's because of you people, your race, your color of your skin, or the shape of your eyes that are treating me badly. I want to say, how can we get together and make America what it could be for everyone?
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to add, there's always been an incitement of, when I mean incitement, it's inciting hate and prejudices that are systemically from white mechanisms. And what those white mechanisms, I mean, here's a perfect example. I don't know if anybody caught the article or the message about an African American woman in Indianapolis. She wanted to test a point. So she had her house appraised in Indianapolis. It was appraised at $100,000. And then she had a friend of hers who was white to go in there and, you know, sort of impersonate the owner of the house. And it got appraised to almost 2.5 times more because it was a white person. So it totally goes to what Demetrius and Perry are saying. There are mechanisms that have been dominating throughout history that unfortunately, the white population, the white supremacy of those mechanisms have continued to flourish to this day. And thus, because I will tell you, and I don't know if Demetrius and Perry will agree with me on this, but there are cultural and also generational issues that were taught. For example, I told you I moved here from Korea to Ames, Iowa, and my story seems very like the movie Minari, even though my father was not a farmer, he was pursuing his PhD. But the cultural resonance of us having to adopt white sort of mannerisms. And then when I moved to Roanoke, Virginia, my best friends were black. And I never saw it the way that my mother and my grandmother and my aunts and uncles saw Boys in the Hood, saw, you know, Compton, those stuff. I mean, my grandmother lived in Carson, California, which is right next door to Compton, and she saw all that. So then these stereotypes and these mechanisms that are already sort of based off of white supremacy start infecting your brains, infecting your perceptions. And that was something that I wanted to bring up because I think it was either Sue Ann or Dedrin that was saying, it's more than just these lines. We have perceptions that we can't seem to change or to twist that has been basically constantly accumulating over the years. I mean, there's jealousies. Let's face it. You know, if an Asian liquor store owner is in Southeast DC selling liquor, there's going to be some sort of jealousy or like, why are you in my neighborhood? Those type of reactions. And we become reactionary. And thus, these are the things that might fuel those racist mechanisms, even amongst each other. And that's what we need to change. So
right, yeah. And one thing I love, I wanted to touch on one thing that Perry mentioned towards the beginning is like, look at class too. I actually never thought about this, but like, you know, impoverished groups are going to be living close to each other. Unfortunately, crimes happen in proximity. So maybe it's not like race driven, right? These attacks. But I wanted to touch on something all of you have been talking about is like our struggles have a lot of parallels. In the end, we're trying to fight against white supremacy and oppression, right? I have also seen a lot of white people like, what the heck? I'm not even in this fight, and y'all are blaming me. Like, what the heck? What's your response to that? And how do you explain the root of white supremacy and its relevance even between Black and Asian relationships?
I'll just tell a quick story that somebody, a friend of mine through a different, through work, through my flute community, very, very woke white man, was, getting a little snippy at some of my postings about anti-white supremacy. And he finally said, look, I treat everyone equally, no matter what. My best friend is Black Jamaican. I don't treat, when I see him, I see a real person. And I said, sorry, brother, I'm not saying you, I'm saying there's a system of white supremacy. And the fact that you can have that privilege is because you're white. I mean, do you see any indigenous people saying they don't have a problem with seeing, issues with white people? I mean, it's about the systems that prevent people of color from having the same access to education, jobs, and housing. You don't have those problems because you're white. You have white privilege. And he kind of slowly came around. So it's like, I have to say, don't take it personally. You're very selfish if you think I'm talking about you and what how you judge people. But it's about the system that we live in.
So,
did you want to add? Oh, sorry, Cece, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, you're fine. I was just thinking, to your point, historical context matters, right? Mm-hmm. So we can't. You can't just erase hundreds of years of oppression on any group of people, especially when there's no restitution or reparations, or at least an adequate form of reparations or restitution for that group of people. And I think I was reading somewhere that like they're saying that even if, like, for example, Black people were paid reparations, that it would take like centuries for us to like catch up economically to our white counterparts. So it's kind of like you can't ignore that. And like you said, Perry, it's not a matter of you getting perks or special benefits, like, oh, here's your white privilege, token, you get a free slice of cheesecake or something,
Ooh, that's good.
Yeah, right. It's about the barriers and the obstacles that you don't have to face because you're white,
right.
You don't have to worry about getting killed.
That's right.
Yeah. If you do, it's not because you're white, more than likely. And there's no system in place that would keep you from getting justice if that were the case.
And there's definitely, I mean, again, forgive me, I don't remember the exact writer or quote, but those who tend to be oppressed, oh, you okay? Those who tend to be oppressed tend to sort of repeat that oppression, not because of intent, but because of what they've suffered. And that is usually the case. I had a very good friend of mine in DC. His parents actually owned a liquor store called Big Ben Liquors over near Capitol Street. And he was shot by African Americans in the back, and he was paralyzed from the waist down ever since. But he also says it's not out of hate that this, I mean, of course the intention was to steal from that store, but he also realized that it's because they too have been oppressed, whether it be themselves specifically, or the history, as Cece pointed out, the historical oppression that's occurred that has fueled this. And this happens. I mean, if you look at the even history with the government against the Japanese in internment camps, the Chinese Exclusion Act, where they treated the Chinese even worse than animals at some point, not allowing them, not even to have even the basic, oh, you can eat here in the back, or you can have water from this particular fountain. I mean, the Chinese were treated even immensely more, difficult. But again, these oppressive, what I call reverberations, continue to plague us. And thus some actions, and Perry pointed out the younger generation, they don't know this. They're only seeing what they're seeing that's been shared through TikTok, Instagram, social media, and that's all they see. They don't understand the even deeper rooted issues that are there. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to educate more, obviously. The classrooms are not doing it. The parents may not even be doing it. We need to figure out ways and avenues to teach them. So.
Can I just chime in on what he said about that? He described these platforms, right? TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. But these platforms are all run on an algorithm, right? Who gets to see what? So everybody, once again, there's a lack of information, or you're only getting certain information that this algorithm believes that you want to see.
Right.
You see? So that's to the point of accountability. If you really want to be informed, you're going to have to do some research, or else you will be infected. It's simple. When COVID was out and you was out, you didn't wear your mask, you didn't do what you were supposed to do. It was the percentage of effective rate of you being effective was very high, because you weren't doing what it took to protect yourself from this infection. And that's that self accountability. So many of us as individuals fail to do that. We fail that accountability part that we need among ourselves, because if we are, quote, woke or whatever, right? And we keep asking, well, what can we do? What can we do? Well, we're actually doing it. Everybody here is already doing it. So is that really the answer, right? Because we all are doing it. So at some point, we have to identify these constructs or these devices that are that are giving this misinformation or not giving people the opportunity, or just recognize that people at the end of the day have their own prejudice, their own way of thinking, and that regardless, I think we've seen it over and over again, regardless of the information that you give them, if they're not forward thinking, if they're not open to change, they're not going to change, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah. Sue and then Dedrin.
Yeah, I was going to say too, as I think about, some of the challenges, and I'm thinking about from a technological perspective and education. And the fact is, a lot of, when you think about the income inequality, you're also talking about the lack of technology. We're all sitting here, working from home, educating from home. But, there are kids who do not have access to a laptop, or they don't have access to a Wi-Fi. And mostly that's, people of color in, rural areas. And so I think part of the issue is it's the whole, concept of, yes, access of technology, access of healthcare, access to, things that they need in order to improve their socioeconomic status. And so I think that's that's a huge issue from my perspective, that, if you can't get to the education part, it's going to be difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Dedrin?
Yes, it feeds right into a point that I had an opportunity to speak to last. Had an opportunity to speak with CNN specifically about this point of techno-racism and the premise of technology and lack thereof. Working against traditional socioeconomic barriers that typically oppress and leave out marginalized voices first and foremost, but then do galvanize around systemic racism. And, you see that whether you're talking about a bank loan or getting into a particular job, or even seeing the news, or even having access to basic technology and functionality. So that absolutely plays a role in what, I think, as we all brought up earlier, having access to events that we all knew may happen in a more localized sense, but being able to be brought on a global scale, absolutely is part of the agency of change that I think this conversation is part of right now. But in that same point, I feel like that we do have to also have this type of conversation on a global scale. Something that I will give to the youth is their sense of being global citizens and more transnational versus having, traditional, geographical alliances or allegiances to culture and the language is something that I think the barriers of technology they've embraced. I think we do see youth being more, diverse in that sense of who they align and advocate for. But at the same time, we do have to acknowledge that those same points of systemic racism that we absolutely see highlighted and know that are the foundations of American history absolutely exist in other, points as well, whether or not we're talking Latin or Asian or any other points. And we see that come to a head once we see generations from other places come into America. Because we see it very plainly that when you come to America, you already have an understanding of where you are in that social hierarchy. And unfortunately for Black and brown communities initially, and particularly for darker skinned people, that translates if you get on a plane and go to other countries, right? It's the idea that there's a global understanding of how this process, because it's built like that, right? It's built on the colonialization of the world, right? That came from Eurocentric powers and built that in as a device to conquer, right? So we have that built into our technology. We have it built into our history. We have it built into our communities. But I think what we can use is the same technology and same experiences across the globe to be able to say these are the conversations we have to have. And as Havana said earlier, they're not going to be pretty conversations. They aren't going to be comfortable because we have to get uncomfortable to have that type of change.
Yes, I think growth requires discomfort, and it wouldn't be proper of me to not bring up model minority myth in an Asian and Black talk. So the model minority myth, I know a lot of people, again, who are not really well versed in these conversations, like, Okay, but you know, Asians are smart and hardworking. Aren't those positive? Like, why is that a problem? How does the model minority myth hurt both Asians and other people of color?
Well, if I may,
Sure.
it's a tool, but of white supremacy to wedge between people of color. I mean, like I said earlier, most Asians are you know, living in poverty. You have 1% of the model minority, quote, you know, I wouldn't say they're model minorities either, but it's just not true. So you can pit the, you know, 30-something% or 40% of other people of color in America against the 5% of Asian Americans and say, look at how well they're doing. You know, you all need to just work a little harder. We don't need affirmative action. And they can let us in the door because there's only 5% of us. And of that 5%, less than 1% actually was let in the door. You know, so it's pretty simple to say, look at the math. It was no sweat off white supremacy's, you know, but to say, let's let them in. And I like to quote one of the first Asian American writers of prominence, Frank Chin, who said, Asian Americans are making it because they don't hate us as much as they hate blacks.
Oh, yes. Because to be a model minority, there has to be a bad minority, right?
Exactly. And so that's part of the reason of why there's tension between, you know, Black and Asian communities. It's like you can, like, they're always pointing to, look at the Asians. They're doing so well. Why aren't you guys doing as well as them? You know, so, I mean, in a nutshell, that's it. I can go on, but.
Yeah. Sue, you had your hand.
So, you know, once again, it goes back to white supremacy. So when I think about the social movement of the model minority myth here, it was in the 60s, and it was developed by a sociologist, William Patterson, who praised the Japanese Americans for overcoming discrimination. And why can't Black people be just as, it's a problem because you can't do it. So now we don't need any help as Asian Americans. And if you do, it's an individual problem. And so they're pitting against each other. It's divide and conquer. And, you know, this is, again, and I'm sitting there like, this was a Caucasian man who came up with this, you know. So once again, you know, looking at the history, as Christian keeps saying, we need to keep doing that. And by the way, for the Vincent Chin, I did want to say $3,000 fine, no jail time. I'm just saying.
Yeah, so, that was ridiculous. Ridiculous. Yeah. But to add on what Sue Ann said, yes, William Peterson, the term model minority was coined back in 1966 by William Peterson. But myth was added not too much later than that. And that myth is what is often sort of scholars and everyone has argued that the assumption is that Asian Americans are doing much better. And that's an overgeneralization, and it's so inaccurate. As Perry mentioned before, there's such a disparity amongst incomes and economic and societal and class factors. And thus, it always pinpoints, oh, look at the Asian American family that just moved in across the street versus the African American family. It's always been this sort of, again, another mechanism that white supremacists are dealing and just touting as fact when it's not fact at all. And I think that's what becomes a major problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's interesting that, like, Asians are in a weird place, right? Because they are sometimes the oppressed and then sometimes the oppressor's sidekick. But the thing is, like, even though we are touted as like hardworking and smart, Asians are the least likely of any group to make it to like top management roles. So yeah, it's fascinating. And I think it hurts because, as Perry and Christian mentioned, like, it erases Asian poverty and other problems within that community.
Yeah. It puts unrealistic expectations on them on an individual level as well, where it's like you're anything short of a genius astrophysicist.
I was so bad at math. I was so bad at math. I was stressed out in my math classes because they would always look at me and go, why aren't you good at math? I mean, it was literally like, I'm not good at math.
Right.
Are you also non-math Asians? Because I'm not a math Asian.
That's how untrue that stereotype is, right?
Yeah, and I think it's a similar model minority myth for the Jewish community as well. But it's a particular type of Jewish person, right? It's an Ashkenazi Jew, not a Jewish person of any other race or ethnicity.
Right.
So
yeah. Oh man. Yes, it's true. And so one of the things I wanted to also touch on is like it's like dehumanizing, right? So this is an interesting thing. Like oppression against Black and Asian people, it exists, but it manifests in very different ways. So like white supremacy dehumanizes both groups, but on almost like opposite ends of the spectrum. People assume, oh, Black people are lazy and emotional, and then Asians are mechanic and disposable almost. I was like, isn't that interesting? Like, how do we reconcile? Like, I think that's where like sometimes there are tensions and divisions, and how do we make people see it's still the same oppression?
I think because I'm in the business of representation, I think representation is really important. What stories are being told is really important because that influences. I mean, like Demetra said earlier, when he finally got to see a non-white hero in Bruce Lee, that changed everything. And I was old enough to witness that change, growing up in West Oakland and Chinatown, where there were tensions every day. If you cross, Broadway into West Oakland, or there was real palpable tension in getting, your money taken and things like that. But as soon as Bruce Lee came out, all those downtown theaters were showing The Big Boss and Enter the Dragon, Return of the Dragon. I started seeing Black people wear Chinese kung fu outfits walking around. And then as we went to those theaters to watch the same movies that were packed with lines around the block with Black people wearing those Chinese kung fu shoes, they were high-fiving us little kids, us Chinese kids, because we were Chinese. I mean, I saw it change. Representation works. And with the right spirit, with Bruce Lee saying, we can overcome this, we can overcome oppression for the greater good. Because all of Bruce Lee's narrative and the stories were the same. I'm going to come in and be with my community to overcome oppression. And everybody identified with that.
I love that. I know representation. I know all of us are in the creative space here. CC and Edrin. I know CC, you founded HBCU Con, right?
Yeah.
Like making a space for Black nerds, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I mean, and Black nerds, and then of course our allies. And I think the beautiful thing about HBCUs is that we've served for over a century and a half, as a hub for not only, Black students, but also students of other races and minorities, because predominantly white institutions at that time had quotas. So if it didn't matter if you were Asian, Pacific Islander, Indigenous, American mainlander, whatever, they were like, oh, nah, our quota is 3 Asians, so we're good. And then you're like, what? Or they might even accept you. That was, I think, what happened with Dorothy Height. She had gotten accepted, and then she got to New York, and they're like, oh, by the way, we met our quota, which was 2 Black women at the time. So yeah, it's very, so I just wanted to highlight HBCUs as a another example of solidarity between, people of color and various races.
I love that.
And also, to your point earlier, appreciation versus appropriation, where like there's martial arts and how Bruce Lee brought martial arts to America. And in the very strong history, as Demetrius was pointing out, especially in New York, Black martial arts community there. And then what was I gonna, it was something else. Oh, and hip hop, we see a lot of elements of hip hop, jazz, rock, in in Asian music, especially like K-pop and J-pop. And then recently I just heard some K-pop because I had Korean barbecue earlier today. And I went to Iron H earlier today, treated my friend for her birthday. But I heard some K-pop that's reminded me a lot of reggae. It's got some like reggae elements too. So
really? Cool.
And I was jamming to it. So
I think it's really cool, and I think it's also cool that groups like BTS have come out and said like we do derive a lot of our influence from Black American music. So yeah.
And I think that just goes to a point of a cultural appreciation versus appropriation, right?
Yeah.
Right. To understand, and to the Bruce Lee premise of, of seeing someone being their authentic self, right? Where we're giving them agency to perform and basically speak, to their truths, and just let that be, not because we're trying to commodify it, not be because we're trying to meet a quota, as it, to kind of CC's point, but to give people the opportunity to be themselves. And we've seen that the same type of conversation that, I'm sure Bruce Lee brought about. We saw the same thing with Black Panther, right? So when we see people put in a space that they can bring that cultural value, and then again, where it's put in a space where everyone can enjoy and vibe in it, I think that's part of this. That's part of our matrix of the solution, right? Or just more of that, right? And I think we've seen it where with the movie Parasite, right, last year. And I mean, I think when, again, a completely non-English film, just because you can see quality, right? That translates, past culture, past language. You can see what's good can be great. And I think that's where we can see those types of wins that can come across, that feel like wins, right? So that's good for the API community to see like that. That's not even a validation. It's just that was just what needed to be done. And so we all can celebrate those types of wins together. And then those are kind of the watermarks that we can say are the things that we need to go to as creators and be able to just make more of those opportunities. We don't necessarily need to make more of the same thing, like, oh, now that's the thing we want from that culture, right? Because that becomes blaxploitation. That becomes, what we expect from this type of group and culture, and that eventually devalues it. But I think us being able to say, we need more of these types of creators to have their own space and platform and their voice, I think that's where that solution.
I don't know how you feel about blaxploitation films, but I grew up with those two, and that was a window for me into Black culture. In downtown Oakland, in those grindhouse theaters where we saw, Coolie High and Blackula and those Willie Dynamite, those blaxploitation films, right next back to back with Bruce Lee films. And I learned about the culture that way also, because I didn't. Again, it was a lot of tension in those years. It was like, how do we find bridges with each other? And it was, training through these films. And I think looking at history, Black people never didn't get a chance to tell their stories. So they started making their own films, writing their own stories. And then look what happened, you start to win Oscars. I mean, and I always encourage Asian Americans to do that, to support Asian American film festivals and producers and writers, because we have to be the ones that write our authentic history. We can't expect a Jewish person in Hollywood to do that for us.
Absolutely.
I agree. It's always been the arts that have brought us or unified us, right? Because the arts are not a construct that's affected by the regime, right? In the sense, because it's individual. These arts come from within, right? But I think there's one important point that we haven't really spoken on when it comes to African American people, and why we haven't overcome, or why we haven't done this, that, or another, is that for the most part, unless you are Latino, everyone else here, your last name is indicative of your heritage. Our last name is indicative of what happened to us, that we were hostages. You know what I'm saying? Not until recently with DNA do we have any idea of where our roots lie in Africa. You see what I'm saying? Where Perry just clearly quoted, he is a fourth and first generation Chinese person. He knows clearly. He can tell you what his last name means, where it comes from. My son's mama and grandparents can tell you where that Lee, he is a Lee. I must tell you, he's a Lee. Anyway, they can tell you. I just want you to know he's a Lee. Anyway, but they can tell you if they were a Han, or if they, or this, that, and that. It's clear. Their last name is a clear root to who they are. But when it comes to Black people, or quote Latino people, because I'm gonna say quote, because you bunched a whole lot of people in that thing that you call Latino, which ain't really it's you mean Hispanic or Latin, or Latin oppressed. That's your language, but that's not you as a people. A lot of these people are African or indigenous native people. But besides that point, everyone else's last name is indicative of their heritage.
Yeah.
So when you have a people still searching for who they are, and they still don't know. Well, some of them could be from this part of Africa, or could be from that part of Africa. But Christian can tell you where his people are from. Perry could tell you. Havana, you can tell me. Sue, you can tell me. Deidre, I bet you can't tell me. Cece, I bet you can't tell me. You see? So that's a huge obstacle that we always forget. That's like right in front of us. That's a hurdle of identity. Of course, we have established an identity being here in America, right? It's in our DNA to establish who we are. We change language, right? That's why you have, Ebonics, right? Because we're creative people, right? So and then those things will have been appropriated or adopted, right? How long we been saying what's up? Now that's regular language, right? So you're gonna wait a while before what's good is regular language. But my point is, you see what I'm saying? We talk about, that
Malcolm X.
Yeah. So I just think that's one thing that we need to remember as African Americans and as quote Latinos. Your last name is not indicative of your heritage.
Mm-hmm.
Very true.
Get back on that, because again, I mean, I think there is that unwritten rule of understanding, but again, to give it highlight and voice is absolutely part of that, right? But I think that's part of where people look to the African American experience, not only from a historical context, but also as a resource of strength, because in spite of those same points, right, that we do wear in a lot of cases the last name of our oppressors, right? We can we share the same last name, especially here in the rural South, right? If you're you're a Jackson, right, you know that if you have the same last name as your white counterpart, that there probably is a point of history to there. And a lot of times, based on your skin color, it went one way or another, right? But at the same time, I think that's also such a valuable resource and commodity of strength and allyship, that the African American experience here really is just paramount, because we've had to build our existence in constant battle with, but in absolute proximity with our oppressor, right? We couldn't move away, right? We couldn't go anywhere else. If you fled the South to New York or out West, that oppression followed you, and we had to put down roots and fight where we stood to make civil rights a thing that then became the blueprint for every other point of civil rights engagement, not only in the United States, but across the world. So I think that's been the real key to us trying to figure out and solve a lot of the civil rights and civil rights opportunities in the world, is that it's looked at, right? Because we go back to, the same experience that saw civil rights here work for South Africa and apartheid, eventually became their point of, okay, we need solidarity, we need civil rights in this sense. But at the same time, we're still fighting that same fight from 400 years ago. And again, to your point, lastly, is that, we were literally beaten and stripped of our language. So the part of the construct that a lot of other cultures and a lot of other races are able to bring into this is an authentic language, right? And so being able to communicate in your language, even if you don't know it, to your point, that not having the same last name, if you're from another culture, more than likely you have some point of retention of the language or languages that are there that help you connect where your culture and your history are from. But we, as majority for African Americans, we don't have that language of context, and so we have the language of our oppressor, to even get those rights. And that's just been our experience therein. So I won't ramble more of it, but I think you brought up a great point. But I feel like in speaking of those last names, we also should speak, to our the opportunity of language and being able to speak, from a cultural standpoint of of us having to build language in solidarity with those who wouldn't stand with us.
Oh, I love it. Oh man, I wish I had like 2-3 more hours with all of you. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you all of you for such amazing insights and for joining this discussion. And to the audience, this is just a start, right? For all the panelists on here, if the audience wanted to learn a little bit more about this topic, what is one resource that you recommend? We'll start with Sue and we'll go down the list here.
Okay, I'm gonna go a little different. I'm gonna go children.
Okay.
There is a color. This is from I'm Not a Virus.
Oh.
And they're updating this coloring book for children, but this is going to include, the next version will include the Vice President of the United States.
Yes.
So I always feel like it has to start at a very young age in the conversation, you know, and so I would just start with that.
Yep. Nice. Terry?
There's a website called Asian American Advocacy Fund.org. So I think there's a lot of links to all sorts of resources to sort of, you know, educate yourself on the fundamentals of understanding what's happening right now.
Perfect. Cece?
Okay, everyone gave such great like nonprofit resources. So I'm gonna give 2 books that I always recommend to folks who are kind of getting their feet wet on this type of stuff. But or not really. The Constraint of Race by Linda Faye Williams. One of my professors, Ralph Gomes, contributed to that book at Howard University. And the second one is Lies My Teachers Told Me. I actually read that probably when I was in like middle school or something. And they recently revised it. You know, they revise it every now and then to add more historical context to it. But that's a great one. It kind of tells you how, you know, our public school systems let you down and what they got wrong and what they left out. Yeah.
Nice. Demetrius?
Well, I can only speak to the Black community that I'm a part of. So I would definitely say go back and study those speeches from Dr. King. Yes. Find out why we marched, you know, and why we did what we did. You know what I'm saying? And I feel that that will give you a nice foundation when it comes to perspective, because that's the first fight, right? And we're still fighting that fight, as Dedrin said.
Nice. Christian?
I posted in our private chat, but it's crossculturalsolidarity.com/Black-Asian-Solidarity. And there's just so much resources, books, films, everything from Black American international solidarities with Asia, books on Black and Asian solidarities in the US. There's even a separate page for books on Black and Brown solidarity as well. You guys should definitely check that out. And then shameless plug here, Perry and I are supposed to be at the, there's a rally happening on the National Mall, May 31st. It's solidarity against AAPIHate.org/DC. I'm handling a lot of the pre-show from 1 to 4, and Perry's one of the actual guests. I'm a nobody. So.
Untrue. Dedrin, last but not least.
Oh, thank you. So I think a resource that's near to me is that we kind of fit into this would be Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Again, it's a volunteer part of the chapter here that have with policy, lawmakers, tech policy, particularly rights and registration, but for the equitable voice of our growing Asian American population here in Georgia and across the United States. So that is Asian Americans Advancing Justice.
Awesome. And then lightning round for the audience who do want to follow up with you. Where can they find you? We'll start with Dedrin, and then we'll go backwards. Dedrin, where can people find you?
Thank you. You can find me on Facebook and LinkedIn under Dedrin Sneed, on Twitter at Green Co-Create. That's Green with a T, Co-Create, and Instagram at Dedrin Sneed. Thank y'all.
Christian?
My website for the film festival is apafilm.org. I also run the DC Shorts Film Festival. That's dcshorts.com. I'm on Instagram as XIANOH, which is if you, this might date me, but I used to spell Christmas, and I think I still do, Xmas, get it? So it's Xian, Christian O. So easy to find me. So.
Demetrius.
For the Urban Action Showcase, urbanactionshowcase.com, LinkedIn, Demetrius Angelo, and Instagram, Demetrius Angelo.
Perfect. CC, where can people find you?
All right. So CC the Geek on all platforms, pretty much. Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, all the old people social medias, as my friend likes to say. My friend Talin likes to, you know, Talin, Havana.
Yes, I do.
But yes, so on all those platforms, and then hbcucon.org. Feel free to check out our website, and we're HBCUCon on all platforms except for Twitter. It's Con HBCU, and then also I'm CC the Greek Geek. But if you go on my Instagram, we got link trees on both. So, and then also really want to encourage you all to sign up for BSU AS. Well, not sign up, but follow BSU ASB on Instagram. That's the Bowie State University's Alternative Spring Break Initiative, and I founded it in 2007 when I was on campus. So. They recently revived the program, and yeah, thank you. And everybody gets one podcast. Everybody gets 01 on all platforms and all your streaming platforms too.
Perfect. Perry?
Instagram, Perry Young Official.
Awesome. And Sue?
LinkedIn, Sue Ann Hong, and apawomen.org. And I think that, and I just got on TikTok, but I don't know how to use it. I'll figure that out later.
You got time.
Somebody, I need Christian to help me. Somebody out here knows how to do this, and I need help with it.
Love it. Great. Well, thank you all again. If you're interested in following up with me, I'm at HavanaWin.com. I have a comic, kamikazecomic.com, and then you can find me on Instagram. Havana_N. And with that, thank you so much to all of our speakers. Yay!
Thank you so much.
Perfect. I loved all the answers and discussion, and I really appreciate your time and your transparency too. Perfect. All right. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.